The idea of a true self is such a complicated concept, and it's one of the biggest challenges of contemporary life, to find a true self or be our true self. I think oftentimes when we think about the concept, we often think about that our true self means aligning ourselves with some type of ideal of what our life should be, right? Maybe by achieving a certain goal or getting a certain job or owning a particular car or living in the right neighborhood, that then we're being our true selves, having the right partner, fitting the image, having the right social media post or something, right? That when we're doing these things, we're living up and being our true selves. And so the issue with that, though, is that oftentimes in trying to do that, we experience setbacks, we experience failures, and even in our successes, somehow those things just don't feel like those accomplishments don't feel like they should. They don't feel fulfilling in the way that we hope they would be fulfilling. And so that idea of being our true selves just is so complicated, and I think a source of frustration, a source of lack of fulfillment, a source of competition even. And so one thing that I really appreciate about the psychologist Winnicott in this essay, Ego Distortions and the True and False Self, is that he offers what I'll explain as an anti-essentialist, a non-essentialist understanding of what it is to be a self. And at the same time, shows us that this lack of satisfaction, this lack of fulfillment from achieving a certain image of who we are, a certain ideal of who we are, why that's so unfulfilling. So maybe traditionally, people might say that, or people believed that the self, the true self, was the soul, right? And so the soul, it doesn't matter if the body dies, the soul is eternal. The soul's home is not necessarily this earthly place. The soul's home is up in heaven with God. And so that's really the true self. It's not dependent on the body. It's not dependent on our circumstances. You could be rich or poor, king or queen, happy, sad, whatever. Achieve a lot, not achieve a lot. You're still a soul in this conception. And that soul is accountable to God. And the really only thing that matters is if the soul is saved or not saved, and if it's going to be eternally punished or eternally rewarded. And so that's very much what gets called in philosophy a essentialist understanding of what it is to be a self. There's some core essence of who we are, and that's the soul. And that's the most important thing about us. It's the one true thing that makes us who we are. And so, in more modern times, society really broke away from that concept of essential idea of the self, right? We kind of broke away from that concept of the soul. And what we developed is a non-essentialist understanding of the self. And so there's a lot of ways that we led up to that in society. There's definitely like the Enlightenment and all the scientific revolutions and Darwin, an understanding that, hey, we're just animals that developed over time. We're not souls. And so there's a lot of ways that different scientific understanding and different advancements in knowledge got us away from that traditional understanding of the self as the essence, as the soul. And then certainly one of the biggest breakthroughs or articulations of that change come from Freud and his developmental model of the self. And so Freud, the baby isn't born as a soul, as a self, kind of already built in. It's like batteries not included. The baby is born, but it's the soul. The soul isn't included. The baby is just born as a human, as a baby, and it develops its sense of self through its interactions with its parents, and later, with the whole family, and then with its society and broader context. And so he introduces the idea of the self that's developmental. And so this is really important. He publishes the interpretation of dreams at like the end of the 19th century, but he dates the publication for 1900 because he wants it to be the first big influential idea of the 20th century. So a part of his big essential idea or new idea for the 20th century is that the self isn't a soul, but rather the self is developed psychologically or through relationships with parents. And so that's a huge breakthrough, and it ends up being a big influence you can think of, even though I think a lot of feminists are critical of Freud, and rightfully critical of Freud. That really led into the insight, or informed the insight that Beauvoir says. She says one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. And so for Beauvoir, right, that we're born babies, but we're born into a society with a certain language and certain conventions, and then we're told that we are those things, we are those national identities, we are those gender identities, we are those, we are a certain social class. And so we're born into a society, and then we already kind of have these certain concepts that already exist outside of us that we're then socialized into and take a certain kind of shape in our identity based on those concepts. And so as that idea develops, we definitely get more into an idea then, okay, well, if I'm not born, but I become a person, then then what is the idea of a true self if the self is made, if the self is constructed, right? There's no true self then, because I make myself. I invented, I can invent another one. It's not like genuine, it's manufactured, right? It's made. And so I think we get into this idea that the self is, because the self is constructed in a way, or the self is a social product, then there's no really any concern for us to worry about it being true or false, because it's just a made thing. And so we really, I think, get into kind of these ideas of, the self is a brand, and we always need to be marketing that brand, make a LinkedIn profile and sell your brand, or, make this album or make this novel or something and sell your brand as that author or as that figure. And so, and so we get this really more empty, this really empty idea that the self is just a made thing, and the only value that we can find in itself is the market value. How other people perceive it, what kind of value they attach to that. Is it high status or low status? Does it seem fulfilling or not fulfilling based on outward achievements and the beauty or lack of beauty of the people that surround us, or the wealth or lack of wealth of the people that surround us? And so I think that that's not a great place. And so I really like how Winnicott I think that's not a great place, and I really like how Winnicott navigates this position between not being essentialist and also holding on to some conception of a true self. And so the way that Winnicott does that is, in some ways he follows in the footsteps of Freud, in other ways he breaks from Freud, but he looks at the mother-child relationship. We'll call it, this is a kind of attachment theory. He's looking at the process of attachment between mother and child. And he really shows that, the baby isn't born as self. The baby is just born, and it's entirely dependent for its survival on the mother. And so what Winnicott describes is how the false self starts to develop, or how the true self can develop. And so the baby, when it's born, is totally dependent on the mother to meet its every single need. And so the baby isn't even aware of itself. So let's say that it's hungry, it just experiences pain, and how it responds to that, it will cry out. Or maybe the baby is hungry and it just makes a certain face, or it reaches out its arms in a certain way. He calls this a spontaneous gesture. This whatever the baby does to express that it has needs. And so then when the baby expresses that it has needs, or that he has needs, then the mother, who is responsive and receptive, then will come and meet those needs and make sure the child is taken care of. And so he describes that the mother literally holds the child, but also metaphorically holds the child. The child doesn't have a sense of self yet, and the mother is that unity, is that security that when the baby has a need, that those needs are going to be met. The mother kind of establishes that foundational trust in the world, right? That the baby is going to be okay, the baby is going to survive. It's not going to be left to die, it's not going to be left to freeze. Its needs can be met. And so when the mother really does do a good job at this, he says when the mother is good enough, really not even like excellent, but just good enough, when the mother is sufficient in his terms of actually meeting the baby's needs and tuning into the baby's needs and responding to them, then the baby has the prerequisites for developing a true sense of self, a true self. The baby is tuned into, or when the baby experiences need or experiences pain, or even experiences joy, positive emotions, that the mother is receptive to that and is tuned into that and responds to that, and so the baby feels validated in that way, or it supports the baby in being tuned into its own feelings. But the other situation, what happens, it kind of ends up being the seeds of the false self, is when the mother isn't good enough, when the mother, because of her own unmet childhood needs, her own negative experiences growing up, the own ways that she was failed by her mother, sees the child not for its needs, but maybe sees the child as a burden, or sees the child as there to be her, meet her needs, maybe her pet or her baby doll or something, right? And doesn't, and treats the child more selfishly, doesn't meet the child's needs, but rather uses the child to meet her own needs. And so what happens when that happens, maybe the baby is hungry and it cries and the mother ignores it. Or maybe the baby needs a diaper change and the mother just leaves it be. And so what happens is the baby then learns to stop expressing its needs, to ignore its needs, and it becomes disassociated from those needs. It's not tuned into those needs, and so it just blocks them out. It doesn't feel it, or it tries to distance itself from those needs. And instead, because it learns when it does what the mother wants, when it fits the expectations of the mother, when it meets the mother's needs, that it then gets its other needs met, like it gets love, it gets attention. And so the baby really starts to learn that when it's compliant to the demands of the mother, and when it ignores its own needs, suppresses its own needs, dissociates from its own needs, then then it's going to get the love that it needs, and it's going to get the food or the resources that it needs, right? So this really provides a basis for not aligning with oneself, but aligning with the expectation of others. And so this provides a basis of what becomes a false self. And so then that even gets more perpetuated, like if the mother is not adequate, and then the family system, Winnicott doesn't get into this, but the family system theory is the idea that if the parents are dysregulated in some way or dysfunctional or not adequate in other ways, then the whole system, the whole family adapts to meeting their needs, and everybody has a particular part that they play, and they play a certain role, and they're not really their true selves. They're, again, kind of perpetuate wearing this mask and playing this false self. And so then that false self can just get developed. It can continue. It's encouraged in school if you fit the mold of school. It's encouraged as you get older and graduate and achieve certain benchmarks. And if you can fit the desired role, if you can keep on wearing the mask of the false self, then people think that's who they really are. They identify with that, and they really remain stuck in that. So what Winnicott describes, though, is a situation where that false self doesn't hold up anymore, where it starts to break down. And so for him, that could be any kind of experience, really. It could be as small as somebody comes to, he's a practicing psychologist, a patient comes to see him because in their relationships, or in his relationships, they're not really able to respond in the right way to the partner, and they're not able to be a full self, or in friendships, they're not really able to break out of maybe they're presenting their professional role or something. They're kind of a stuffed shirt, just kind of a always acting a part and never really able to be natural and connect with people. Or it could be more dramatic. It could be a divorce, or it could be a death of a friend, or it could be a job loss or something dramatic, just anything that really breaks that continuity of the false self and forces somebody to start reflecting about the way that things aren't working. And so that might then bring them into a psychologist's office. And so what Winnicott found is that oftentimes when people go to a psychologist, they're bringing their false self into the session, and if the psychologist isn't really aware of attachment theory, or isn't really informed by family systems or trauma, or really just hasn't even worked through their own issues enough, then the goal of therapy most of the time becomes just fixing up the false self, and putting the mask back on, gluing the parts back together, and resolving issues enough that the person can kind of get back out there and keep acting the part. So I'd say that happens most of the time. But Winnicott kind of offers that the more challenging thing and the more difficult thing is to actually try to find a way of breaking through that false self, using this moment of crisis or breakdown or inadequacy to provide an opportunity for the person to find a true sense of self. And so how does he do this, and what are the risks? And so what he says is that how he's kind of succeeded in doing this is that, after developing a rapport with the patient, he says, he points out to the patient that that something's missing, that they're not a self, that they've never, maybe he'll say something like that they never existed, or, that they're, that they're physically an adult, but emotionally they're not an adult at all. And so he'll point out these gaps, or he would point out these gaps, and oftentimes when he would do that, for the first time, patients would actually have a breakthrough with that, where they would recognize a kind of validation in that negative statement. That really, for the first time, somebody actually brought it, if somebody actually acknowledged this kind of empty feeling, this gap that they feel, this feeling that they're not really living their lives in a way that feels real to them. And so then that gap can actually provide an opportunity for then somebody to start searching about, and kind of get more in touch with who they really are. And so it's a tough thing, though, as he describes it, because like that false self has done so much of the work, that false self is the one that is constantly carrying the person. That the person has really become really dependent on that false self. And so it can lead to, in therapy, a situation where a person becomes, almost infantile in a way that they become very dependent on the therapist, or they become very infantile and very dependent on their partner or something in a way that is really overwhelming. And so Winnicott sees opportunity to like work through that. And it's essentially like if you've never been a true self, you've never had a chance to develop that, then it's like never having stood on your own 2 feet and really trying to go back and walk for the first time. And so, that process is interesting. This gets a little bit beyond Winnicott, but that process is really challenging and difficult because it involves it involves exploring those shadows and those cracked places and really digging into and finding a sense of familiarity with what's actually going on there. And so a lot of that is becomes a process of remembering our childhoods and what our relationships with our mothers were actually like. Did they actually meet our needs, or were we more kind of rewarded for being that good little boy or being that good little girl that met the parents' needs and put them first, and we're so good and so mature, and by not meeting our own needs but rather meeting the parents' needs? Were we validated for playing a certain role in the family? And it's a process. It's a difficult process because of the process of, it's a painful process. It involves grieving, it involves getting honest about what experiences actually were, who these people actually were, and getting honest about maybe that they didn't love you in the way that they said that they did, that the relationship wasn't what it was pretending to be. And so that can all be really painful. But what comes out of that, or what Winnicott sees as an opportunity of that, is for the first time for the person to really come to terms with themselves and to start to tune into themselves with how they actually feel, what their spontaneous needs are, what their spontaneous joys are, and to tune into that and then become more aligned with that. So I like that idea a lot, because it's not like there's you break down the false self and then there's just some true self there that you just discover, or once you discover and work through all this stuff, then there's just the true self that you are, and that's it, set for all eternity. It's like, no, there is no essence of the self, but rather we can still hold on to the idea of a true self in terms of aligning and getting in tune with our own feelings and our own reactions, and just being able to actually feel our own histories and understand what our histories actually were, and then also tune into our own present, our own feelings and our own interactions in the present. And that might change, it might be, for this period I feel this certain way, or something doesn't sit right with me, but at a later point it, something, it feels like the right thing. And so all of that doesn't have to be one permanent way that we are, or one permanent situation, or there being some type of one final resolution. I think that we always have these gaps in life, these ways that we that life isn't